Tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice you shall pursue, says Deuteronomy. We are a people whose tradition and sources champion the value of justice. We are a people whose experience throughout history has made us acutely aware of the evil of injustice. For many of us, a deep commitment to advancing the cause of justice is the beating heart of our Jewish identity. As our community has moved away from a values conversation about Israel to a political debate about it, we talk a lot about the conflict and demographic challenges, the conflict in Israel's public relations, the conflict and its impact on our economic relations with Europe. We've stopped talking about the demands of the value of justice. In this next session, my colleague Yehuda Kurtzer will explore the various meanings and implications of this value. How do a people for whom the value of justice plays such a central role in its discourse and self-understanding employ this value in thinking about and addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? What kind of claim does it have upon us? What obligations does it give rise to? And how do we balance our visions of justice against the stark reality of the conflict, against the demands of competing values, and against alternative understandings of justice itself?
Of all the values we bring to bear in thinking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, none enters our rhetoric as often or in as many different and sometimes opposing ways as the value of justice. We know of its frequent use by people on the left, as far left as organizations like Students for Justice in Palestine, for whom justice means a very radical solution to the conflict, including full rights for Palestinian refugees, and often implies a one-state solution. In this context, justice echoes with the broader field of social justice and makes for clearly leftist politics, albeit with some diversity in that camp. But justice is also a value that is considered dear to people on the right and implies a relationship between justice and justification. The term justice can explain how since Israel won wars that it didn't initiate, since Jews were expelled from Arab lands, since it can be shown that international law is on the side of the Jewish state on many matters, the claims of the Israeli government are fundamentally just. In this approach, its adherents would not yield the claim of justice to the left and rely on other arguments, but could argue quite strongly that justice is on their side as well. Justice is simply a value that most Jews not only take seriously, but consider essential to who they are as Jews. It is not merely something we consider good and important, but a value we hope to use to describe ourselves, that we are people meant to embody justice and to be identified with justice. Moreover, justice is a value that intrinsically contains obligations. When an action is considered the just or righteous thing to do, it is problematic to avoid it or to violate it. So when this term is used, it is not merely another value to be considered, but an essential variable in our decision-making and our politics. But if justice can be used for opposing arguments, then it seems we may be working with a range of definitions for what it actually means. We should not allow a conversation to be closed down by someone's insistence that their political position is correct because it's founded on justice. We have to ask, by what theory of justice is it correct? Is that a fair understanding of how justice works in the Jewish tradition? And can we be open to the possibility that a sophisticated and complex understanding of justice makes possible the use of the value of justice in support of totally different arguments? I would like to make this argument today to show that there is a range of options in how our tradition challenges us to live according to the value of justice with really different implications. I want to present a hierarchy of what it can mean to act justly, from a more limited to a more expansive approach to this value, In presenting in this way, I want to suggest that it can mean a variety of things to act upon the principle of justice in our decision-making and our behavior. And where we decide to limit our definition of justice will have an impact on how we ultimately act. More than that, I want to ask whether we can chart out a reasonable position that takes seriously this obligation to do justice in the context of the conflict, but one that at the same time will allow for the possibility of other values, such as self-preservation, compromise, and fairness, to live alongside it. Because taken alone, like any singular value out of context, a commitment to justice can invite extreme and dangerous political positions. On this hierarchy of behaviors in the service of justice, when we ask what it means to actually do justice and not just use the banalities of justice, justice, you shall pursue, the most basic way of acting justly can be captured by the phrase of do no harm. A person can be good and can act justly not just by doing good things, but by avoiding wrongdoing. Anytime you walk into a store and actually pay and you don't steal something, you are doing good. It is clearly a very low level of acting justly, but it is the first rung on this hierarchy. Interestingly, President Obama's foreign policy mantra has often been characterized this way, as a formal policy of don't do stupid things. It is criticized for the same reasons. Not doing something is not the same as actually doing something. And even if not doing something is a corrective against what might be considered to be bad policy, there may be moments that require greater intervention. Nevertheless, this is one rung in the process. It is best captured in our sources by the core obligation that befalls humankind in the second creation of the world after the flood. You will recall that when God first created human beings, God said, "Be fruitful and multiply," and commanded the people to go out and conquer the world. God left out a critical piece of the instructions, namely, that the basic limit of human conquest is meant to be other human beings. The limit of my right to punch is the bridge of your nose. Because of these failed instructions the first time, the world deteriorates rather quickly. And now, given a second chance, God tells Noah and his offspring virtually the same instructions, but with a twist, the prohibition of bloodshed. The human being has total autonomy to rule, except at the cost of others. This is the core of the idea of do no harm as the essential guide to Jewish conduct. In later Jewish tradition, this is expressed by Hillel in his famous mantra to the man standing on one foot. But notice, Hillel does not say the golden rule, do unto others as they would have do unto you. The more basic ethical precept, the one he uses, is that which is hateful to you, do not do to others. From a moral perspective, this is weaker. Instead of doing something, I am not doing something, but is still considered foundational enough to constitute an entry point for this potential convert. This idea of justice, this idea of doing no harm, eventually becomes canonized into Jewish law and bridges very nicely to our topic of justice when it comes to how the court is meant to treat the accused in a capital case. One of the characteristics of the rabbinic tradition is a profound anxiety about what would happen if our court made a mistake in a capital case and killed someone who wasn't actually guilty. As a result, the rabbis go to great length to elongate the judicial process, to leave no stone unturned, to make absolutely sure that they would not perpetrate an injustice by unjustly killing the wrong person. This is the theory of do no harm taken to its logical conclusion as it relates to what it means to live justly. It means first that you try to prevent your own wrongdoing, and you try to prevent the wrongdoing from taking place under your own watch. For the rabbis, the ultimate injustice would be in doing something like taking someone's life that you couldn't reverse. So they will bend over backwards in matters of criminal law to avoid this possibility, even if they will not achieve full justice in convicting a criminal as a result. For our purposes in thinking about the conflict, someone committed to justice, for whom this was their understanding of justice, would simply seek policies and solutions that avoided the perpetration of injustice going forward. This theory of justice is less concerned with dealing with injustices in the past and mostly interested in the present and future, and not so much with doing the right thing, but with avoiding doing the wrong things. A second level up in this hierarchy of justice is that one seeks not just to not do something wrong, but that one is meant to strive to do good for others and for society. Of course, we have many texts in our tradition about the good things we are meant to do, the mitzvot, the legal obligations that we are instructed to do for God and for other human beings. But a few of these stand out in helping us to formulate a vision of doing justice as an affirmative act and not just as an avoidance of doing harm. We can call this the justice of I might have thought. I might have thought is a phrase that introduces mitigating circumstances. It means that a moral person should have been allowed, under certain circumstances, to respond in morally justifiable ways that are not as good as the tradition would like. If we follow the line of reasoning of do no harm, then I might have thought that if I was to find myself in these situations, I could either do nothing, since I am not making things worse, or I could perhaps avoid detection. A higher level of doing justice, then, is doing good even when it is morally possible to get away with not doing it. Let's take a few examples. One example is the biblical injunction against bearing a grudge. I understand the obligation of love thy neighbor as yourself. I understand the responsibility to treat others at a very high level of respect and consideration, correlating to how I might want to be treated. I might have thought that this should exclude people who have wronged me, others who had perpetrated an injustice against me. The biblical requirement here, therefore, not to bear a grudge is a higher level of obligation. Not bearing a grudge is a challenging thing to do. It's a harder obligation to do good at a higher level than might be expected. Or, even more powerfully, the Bible's version of what has now become known and popularized by the show Seinfeld as Bystander Laws. According to Deuteronomy 22, a person is not permitted to avoid intervening and return the lost animal of a friend. And this law is extended even more radically by Exodus 23 to mean the lost animal of an enemy. Here, the logic of I might have thought is doubly useful. I might have thought that my moral obligation to another person is only when I am directly party to the transaction. I can't steal from him, and on the limited level of do no harm, that would be the limit of the wrongdoing I could do. But here I'm actually obligated to intervene in returning their lost property, even when I was not responsible for its disappearance. The innovation of the bystander law raises the bar on social responsibility and makes the bystander complicit or equivalent with the act of stealing. Moreover, I might have thought that this would apply only to my own people, that this high level of moral responsibility extends only to the us. Exodus in this text, and the elaborate text about taking care of the stranger in your midst, elevates the obligation of justice to include even those who are not of you. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum writes eloquently about what it means to take seriously the garden of the righteous persons at Yad Vashem, and the basic act of human dignity involved with someone who was neither victim nor perpetrator to intervene, at risk to their own lives, in saving innocent people. A person who lives under the mantra do no harm is not necessarily implicated by failure to act, but a higher level of acting justly would be fulfilling this obligation. Or in her book, The Rescuer, Dara Horn chronicles the life of Varian Fry, an amazing person who saved the life of many Europeans, artists and intellectuals during World War II. And she observes wisely that for most people who do amazing things like this, even at risk to their own lives, it doesn't feel heroic, only obvious and necessary. This is the theory of justice that the Torah tries to teach here with the bystander laws. It is not just that you're not allowed to be a bystander. It is more intense. How could you possibly be a bystander? And a third example of the logic of I might have thought. I might have thought that this obligation to do good, beyond even just avoiding harm, should only apply when it does not involve my own losses. After all, a person might argue that the minute that they begin to accumulate a financial loss in doing something for someone else, that these actions would shift from the realm of justice to charity. Charity is giving of myself and my own and has its own systems. Justice is the set of actions that make a society right. But the laws of the sabbatical year shatter this paradigm. And in Deuteronomy 15, the categories of charity, taking care of the poor, and justice, or building a model society, become merged. We achieve this by releasing debtors of debts, and ultimately in the Jubilee year, resetting all land ownership. The message of this obligation, especially when it is coupled with the obligation to take care of the poor that follows in the same chapter, is that we don't take care of the poor because it's a nice thing to do. We take care of each other as shared stakeholders in the same society. Sometimes we are on top, sometimes we are on the bottom, but justice is the set of actions we undertake to reset the balance as best as possible. The distinction between these two tiers of acting justly should be clear. The first is to avoid harm and wrongdoing. The second, much more ambitious, is to do good to others, Jews and non-Jews alike, because of a higher sense of moral responsibility. And this higher tier, in turn, has a really different implication for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Unlike the do no harm model, which might suggest some low-grade improvements in the current reality, but no demand for systemic change, this higher level of the pursuit of justice would demand of the actors to significantly exceed their efforts to ensure that they're trying to pursue justice in every aspect of the conflict and the occupation. It is not sufficient to avoid perpetuation of the injustices, but some greater action is required. It is not sufficient simply to be right. Justice would require doing an unexpected level of good. Finally, I want to name a third and highest rung of pursuing justice, and also the loftiest. And this is captured in the conventional usage of the terminology of tikkun olam, the perfecting of the world. This vision of justice not only doesn't stop with doing good things in spite of our impulses to the contrary, but is obsessed with the idea of perfection in such a way that the incremental steps become less significant than the pursuit itself. A Jew who is truly committed to tikkun olam, not just as a saying, but as a set of core obligations, would in turn be incredibly committed to the resolution of the conflict, and probably very distressed by any perpetuations of any injustices at all in the process of getting there. As the highest standards of what it means to pursue justice, it also creates the greatest demand and expectation on Jewish actions in the process. But the challenge of seriously living under this obligation, living according to this commitment of a perfect sense of true justice, is that it is functionally unachievable, even as it inclines the believer to radical politics. Perhaps, the very unachievability of this vision of justice is meant to help us not get carried away, to recognize that there must be a healthy difference between pursuing this kind of an ideal justice as a virtue, but knowing that we shouldn't believe in the kind of radical sectarian politics that a commitment to this perfection would force on us. So we have seen three tiers or rungs of acting justly and pursuing justice as a primary Jewish value. And clearly all three play out with different implications from what we would expect of the Jewish state in living out this value to the fullest. Hopefully it is clear that the value of justice is something that can be owned and taken seriously regardless of one's political leanings, especially when it's understood at the most basic level. When justice, however, is amplified as the primary value and amplified to its most extreme version, it creates a greater sense of urgency towards resolving the conflict as we try to achieve a just outcome not just for ourselves, but for the other. Nevertheless, I hope we can hear the importance of this value across the political spectrum and consider it as part of the cocktail of values that we assemble as part of how we see the world, and an important variable to consider in how our ethics align with our politics. But I now want to introduce a second critical question for us to consider. To do justice in the context of the conflict involves not just what we do now, but how we reckon with history and past injustices. The conditions of the present are the consequences of the past, and sometimes doing what is just requires a reconsideration, or at least an assessment of the past, and some course correction as a result. To assume bygones are bygones is a decision that cannot be made unilaterally. In our next session, we will look at this issue in greater depth, with an in-depth study of an episode from the 1948 war and the array of possible responses. But today, I want to continue our effort to think conceptually and in clean categories about how the value of justice makes us think about the possibility of injustice in the past. I want to propose here that reckoning with past injustice as a means of ultimately doing justice also takes place on three planes. There is first the level of acknowledging wrongdoing and harm done as a necessary precondition to be able to talk about the pursuit of justice. Second, there are the remedies that can be undertaken to repair the injustice in a way that is palatable to both the aggrieved and the aggressor. The highest level might be in trying to restore a perfect original condition, the total unmaking of the injustice, But as I will argue, much like the vision of perfect justice, this hope may represent an unreasonable standard of justice as applied to a real-life conflict, and we may need to make do with the slightly imperfect. The best narrative example in our tradition of what it means to acknowledge one's own misdeeds as a means of making justice possible is David's apology for putting Bathsheba's husband in the line of fire and ultimately having him killed. The apology comes after an extended dialogue with the prophet Nathan. One of the most telling elements of the story is David's righteous indignation in hearing the prophet's parable. To the reader who knows the backstory, and to the prophet, it is precisely this righteous indignation which is the most unjust part of the story. By signaling that David is convinced he knows the right way to act but has acted opposite, the text suggests it is not sufficient to merely be committed to doing justice in a vacuum or from this day forward. Doing justice means also reckoning with your own wrongdoings, which becomes clear in the apology that David offers at the end of the story. As is always the case, however, there are injustices, such as those that come with loss of life, that can never be fully rectified. We saw this earlier in the rabbinic anxiety about capital murder cases. No apology can ever suffice to make up for this magnitude of injustice. Nevertheless, acknowledging the harm done and apologizing for it represents the first step in rebuilding one's own capacity to do justice. This is expressed in legal terms by Maimonides, who opens up his code of law on repentance with the insistence that the process of repentance starts with confession. As we also know from the High Holiday liturgy, God does not forgive sins that people commit against one another without the parties apologizing to each other. This is, in essence, Judaism's first step in its own approach to the process of truth and reconciliation. It is also, in contemporary Israel, considered politically dicey. Israel's President Ruvi Rivlin made headlines with his apologies in 2014 for Israeli actions committed against Arab populations in the past. This was considered in the political world to constitute an act of concession, as though if Israel admits wrongdoing, it invites automatic sanction or yields ground at the negotiating table. From a Jewish values perspective, this need not necessarily be the case. It may be a first step in making something right without dictating the eventual outcome. It may not be fair to make concessions without getting concessions in return, but it may well be just to do so, and we should be mindful of that important distinction. The second step is even more politically complicated, and it is the act of reparation or restoration that help heal past injustices. A person cannot achieve full repentance just by acknowledging what she did wrong, or even just by apologizing. To Maimonides, a person has not fully repented until they find themselves in the same situation and act differently. This means not just an apology, but a proven ability to act differently. What is more insincere than an apology that keeps getting repeated because the person keeps committing the same infraction? And in practical terms, when we move from repentance to larger societal behavior, this means reparations and restorations. If you hurt someone or damage their property, an apology and proven success at not doing it again are not nearly enough. You need to find a way to pay back the damage. This is a huge sticking point in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, especially as it pertains to the Palestinian refugee problem. Israel has been reluctant to admit wrongdoing in creating the refugee problem in 1948 with the birth of the State of Israel. This is in part because it doesn't fully buy the Palestinian narrative, but also largely because it fears stage 2. If Israel admits wrongdoing, what debt does it incur to itself? Is the debt manageable? Is the reparation realistic? It's interesting to compare this to the still ongoing debate in America about reparations for slavery, and to notice how fast the debate runs aground when people start throwing around numbers. Multiply the lost wages of American slaves by the cost of inflation, and the cost of actual reparations would destroy the American economy. But as a result, because of the fear of that second stage, even the first stage, the serious admission of wrongdoing in America for its long-standing treatment of blacks, has been weaker than it should have been. The pursuit of justice can and should be incremental, even if the long-term objective is to achieve a perfect vision of justice. It seems to me the most critical component in a conversation of how we can productively apply the value of justice to this conflict is the nuance. that in order to achieve justice, we should not demand the perpetration of a second injustice. This is at the root of the stunning text from the Talmud in Gittin about a house built with a stolen beam. The demand for perfect justice, the justice we all want to see in the world, would require the unmaking of the house to restore the beam to its rightful owner. His claim on it is profound, and it never goes away. It was stolen from him. But it is Hillel's more balanced position which puts justice in its place. Calculate the monetary value of the beam and pay back what is reasonable, and do not demand the destruction of another house, a second injustice, as an attempt to correct the first. Hillel takes this position both to keep the world going round, but also because he is aware that otherwise people would be reluctant to admit their own wrongdoing. Think about it. If the resolution of the Palestinian refugee problem can only happen with massive restitutions of Palestinians to their ancestral homes, not just in the West Bank, but in Israel proper, displacing thousands of Israelis, destabilizing Israeli life, and unmaking Jewish sovereignty in Israel, it will never happen. And not only that, but the fear of that zero-sum reality will undermine efforts of working towards justice, efforts towards acknowledgement of harm by both sides, efforts towards repair and restoration, and the broader efforts in the pursuit of a bigger sense of justice. Justice must be balanced by a pragmatism that acknowledges it will be imperfect while striving for the perfect. Or alternatively, if achieving a just end to the conflict with the Palestinians would either require a series of unfair concessions, the assuming by Israel of an unsustainable anxiety, or any other injustices, then paradoxically, the quest for justice would produce its own injustice. Justice in the real world and in complex conflicts must be balanced by a consideration not just for what is right, but for what is good. Otherwise, we can't hear it, we can't take it seriously, and we will fight against its demands. So, we looked at 3 tiers of justice, ranging from doing no harm to achieving a perfect world. And we looked at how we make good when injustice has been previously perpetrated. Ultimately, we are left to consider how justice can be a driving force for multiple ideologies and positions in the Israeli-Palestinian spectrum, but also how a balanced stance about the obligations and limits of justice might be helpful in situating us towards a principled middle. Justice in the real world involves a striving for the justice imagined in a perfect world, with the constraints of the real world keeping its demands reasonable. Taken alone, the value of justice can produce distorted viewpoints and disruptive politics. In the context of a broader value system, it serves as a useful reminder of one of the most aspirational aspects of what is meant to be the moral character of the Jewish people. Thank you.